Hey everyone, today we're going to cover two games into Briar. Specifically, one of these games is going to be racing Briar, and the second one is going to be having Briar try to fatigue us. With the update in dash list, opting for more heavy boost strategies, there's now a counterplay from players to try full blocking the deck, hoping that as you boost a bunch of cards, you're going to eventually banish your entire deck and run out of threats, and that your opponent can win the game by simply not attacking you. So because of this, there's now a consideration to start Induction Chamber rather than Teklo, so that way late game you're able to still leak damage, because Induction Chamber and Teklo Pistol are a little bit more evasive than just simply having the pistol late game with no other item, because Teklo has gone after its 3 uses. So because of that, if we're going to be running Induction Chamber, it is kind of important to now consider if Briar is actually better racing us. So we're going to be testing that here today. So here, our opponent is just going to be playing first. They're going to come in with the Belittle, and so we're just looking to block out here on the first turn. All of our cards block for 3 and they pitch well, and so we're able to comfortably block things out here. Spark of Genius is not as great to tutor out Teklo on the second turn because it requires too many resources and we end up giving tempo away that way. But it is possible to maybe block down a 1 hopefully, because playing it for 0 to go get a Teklo Core is also pretty great. However, since our opponent's going to get red Minnowism, it might be a little bit harder for us to keep this whole hand, so we're probably going to be comfortable full blocking this turn. Swarming Gloomveil come in for 6, and so now we're going to draw into our first hand here, and looking at this, we're able to play 2 zipper hits, boost a card, and then we can even use Foundry Heart here. After we play the second zipper hit, we can put a counter on the pistol and the Induction Chamber, and then play Spark of Genius. However, I'm not sure if my opponent at this point in the game is going to try to full block me yet. And so because of that, I maybe want to use my deck more as a resource this game. And so I want to be a little bit more careful with the number of cards I'm boosting. But since my opponent has said no blocks 2 times in a row this turn, and of course in this testing game we're trying to race here. So I know what the strategy is going into this, but if this were a match in a tournament setting, and I don't know what my opponent's doing yet, there is a consideration to maybe not use the Foundry Heart, but just because of the fact my opponent said no blocks twice in a row and took 8 damage, I know that they're not trying to full block me, so using the 2 cards for an extra resource from the deck, I think is a better trade-off there. Now, our current hand actually does work pretty well, blocking for 3 at some point, mostly because we have T-Bone into Red Throttle off of the blue pitch, and then we can even use a payload. So we can even do a line where we play T-Bone, we then close the chain, activate Foundry Heart, pitching the blue, so then we have 2 resources, we can boost Throttle and then have a dominated payload. Now here's the deal from my opponent's side. They're going to dump their hand into the Snatch. It already has Go again, and it comes in for a lot of damage, but the thing is, I'm honestly fine maybe letting this go through. The main reason is because at this point they have no resources floating and they only have 3 cards. They have no way to make another embodiment, so it does seem like the power level of this turn might go down a little bit, mostly because of the fact that they don't have CMH out or anything like that. I also know the other card in their hand is Earthlord Surge Yellow, which pretty much means that there's not a whole lot of threats that they could draw here that I'm actually very concerned about. And so I'm pretty comfortable waiting to see possibly another on hit come through before I'll actually use a card. And also this way, mostly because of the buffs on Snatch, it's almost just not even worth it at that point. And so it would be easier for a card that doesn't have a bunch of buffs, stacked on top of it. That'd be much easier to use our payload for. Now, I probably should have still used the payload to maybe block the Rosetta Thorn, but my main concern now is actually wanting to keep an extra payload arsenal. I think that the payload might do more here rather than simply using it to block 3, especially if I'm going to be racing. However, I do think I missequenced this turn a little bit. I think I should have done the previous line where there's 2 possible options here. I honestly think the best one would have been to play Throttle, close the chain to Foundry Heart, float 2 resources, break Goliath Gauntlet, play T-Bone into payload with +2 and dominate. I think that this way, you obviously don't leak as much damage through, but it may convince my opponent to block, which is honestly kind of good for us because then we can start to steal tempo from Briar here. Because if she blocks the cards, her turns are a lot weaker. I still think that overall this was sort of a misplay. But we also do have the 2 resources from our Teklovossen on the field, which does make this a little bit easier. And I'll be honest, I completely forgot about that watching this replay. And so now we have a couple different hands here. We could even play Payload into a second one, but I think the best course here is to shoot the pistol for 2, have go again so that the chain is still open. But now there's a consideration between closing the chain to reload the pistol or throwing the payload. If we throw the payload here, it does dominate, but we're down a resource, unfortunately. That's a pretty big problem. But the thing is, my opponent hasn't blocked with any cards, and I don't think that they're going to take the opportunity to full block a payload anyway. So instead, I opt to get an extra resource off Foundry Heart to just reload items to maximize that damage, and then still throw payload for 6 with no boost and no dominate. But the thing is that I had a feeling my opponent wasn't going to be blocking anyway. And so the Briar, of course, is trying to set up a massive hand with Weave Earth here, although I accidentally drew an extra card. But so at this point in the game, we are concerned about Channel Mount Heroic, we're concerned about Force of Nature pivot turns, but we still are pretty comfortable considering that we have Crown of Providence and we have Tekla Foundry Heart still. This current hand is actually pretty weak. We have High Octane and Maximum Velocity in the same hand, which don't work well together, and we also have Combustible Courier, which also doesn't work well with any of the other cards in our hand. There's no secondary card to boost for Combustible Courier to get value. We don't have enough 0 cost in our hand for High Octane to get any value through the pistols, and we don't have enough boost cards for Maximum Velocity to even fire. So this is probably one of the worst hands we could possibly get. The upside is that this hand blocks for 9 as well as pitches for 3, but we see our opponent coming with Promise of Plenty, so that's the best time for us to use our crown, so we can hopefully get an arsenal. And we get possibly the best arsenal hit ever in the form of red zipper hit. We also drew a red zipper hit off of the Crown of Providence. So now our hand is looking absolutely phenomenal, and it's probably going to be a very easy way for us to pull out our opponent. Our opponent reloads their arsenal off the Promise of Plenty and plays a second Weave Earth, which does generate them a massive turn as well. And on the Briar side of the table, this is actually a really powerful turn. However, as long as we're able to clutch our hand, we're probably going to be okay. And it seems like we would very easily, off the Tekla core, we would have 5 resources with the Tekla Pounder, and so it's pretty reasonable that we could play Combustible Courier into Zipper Hit, and then float that last resource at the very end. We can then close the chain to Foundry Heart, and then play the Maximum Velocity. Since the Maximum Velocity doesn't need the boost cards on the chain, it just needs that it just needs to have been followed up after 3 boosted cards this turn. And so we're able to close the combat chain to play it, even if that requires losing all the 3 boost cards on the chain, if that makes sense. So with our current hand, we would be really comfortable only blocking with the High Octane and then coming back at our opponent for an absolute insane amount of damage. And here they're going to fire off Sonata, and they're just going to go through most of their turn. We're pretty much going to say no blocks here, unless if anything is a super important on hit or it presents a ton of damage that's lethal. But currently, if Combustible Courier hits, which maybe we should assume that it doesn't. So let's assume that Combustible Courier doesn't hit. Our hand would come in for a total of 24 damage, which is going to rip the Briar's entire hand. If Combustible Courier does hit, then the hand comes in for a total of 27 damage, as well as the pistol shot at the very end, which is pretty absurd. And so with nothing else, we're pretty comfortable saying no blocks here. We are at 19 life. We technically still have 2 block left on the Foundry Heart, which we're going to cash in here to block out the Snatch. We're a little bit concerned about Lightning Press, but given what we've seen from the opponent so far, being on a more heavy Earth build, I'm not super concerned about it. And then we're going to see Channel Mount Heroic. So, pretty impactful turn from our opponent as a very strong setup turn, but I think their turn could have honestly been a little bit better, and instead they left us with a hand that should absolutely blow them out here if done correctly. And so, just like what we talked about, we're going to get 5 resources, and then we're going to get up to 6 with Foundry Heart. And so that's going to allow us to play out both our Zipper Hits, our Combustible Courier, and our Maximum Velocity. Once again, it's important we play the Combustible Courier first, mainly because it is going to buff the Zipper Hit, which should not be the last card play on the chain. We are tempted to actually play a Zipper Hit first, and then to weave the combustible courier in second, just in case my opponent wants to block with armor. Just like that. Because if my opponent maybe blocks with a non-attack on the zipper hit, then we could get them pretty good, you know, with the combustible courier if they put armor on the previous attack. So with this hand, it's only better to play the combustible courier second, because the other cards are just raw damage and don't actually have any relevant on hits. After this, my opponent is starting to read that they might be getting hit with maximum velocity, and it's probably too late just because it's going to take so many cards from them. They're not really going to have a super relevant channel mount heroic turn, unfortunately. And now we're going to close the chain, go up to 2 resources, and then play our maximum velocity because we boosted 3 times this turn. And this is going to be pretty brutal for our opponent. We're going to get all their armor just to survive. They want to obviously keep the channel mount heroic on the table if they can. And depending on how many cards my opponent blocks with, it is also possible to break Achilles' Accelerator and shoot with Teklovossen Pistol this turn. But my opponent goes to 3, so it's not low enough for us to do that. So we're just simply going to leave them with a 3-card hand, no equipment, and they opt to just pass the turn and let... oh no, sorry, they're blocking with channel mount heroic. They had a second one. They do still have a 3-card hand, which depending on what the cards are, could still present lethal here, but once again, our cards do block for 3, so that puts us in a pretty good position, especially when even a 2-card hand here is pretty strong in the form of throttle. We can throttle, leave a resource floating, which then allows us to pistol twice, or we can close the combat chain to Foundry Heart, get an extra resource, and then pistol a total of 3 times using the Achilles Accelerator, and at 3 life, it probably means that every single time we shoot the pistol, we're going to be ripping a card from our opponent. However, my opponent also doesn't really present anything that is super impactful this turn. We do get hit with 7 damage in total from the Swarming Gloom Veil since they make a rune chant beforehand, and now the second one also comes in for 6. So that puts us down to 3. With Rosetta Thorn, that would put us down to 1 since they haven't played a non-attack action this turn. There is a chance to maybe not block with a single card, however the only problem is that that puts us in a really dangerous position. Any way that they can keep a hand that does 2 arcane damage instantly kills us, so I am somewhat interested in maybe not going down to that level of life total. That threshold is a little bit more dangerous, but it looks like I'm going to go all in on it. And I mean, it makes sense here, honestly. With High Octane, I mean, even with the previous hand, we're pretty much going to rip every single card. The only difference is if we do keep the High Octane, there's a really good chance we just straight up have lethal here, which is a pretty big deal. And I think I probably should have just opted to play the High Octane first. I think the only consideration is that if I keep this current hand, I can probably rip every single card from my opponent and then still actually arsenal the High Octane, which then pretty much guarantees that I have lethal on the following turn, especially with my opponent being as low as they are. Pistols eventually are going to have to get blocked with full cards, and so here I know that I'm going to get every single card from my opponent. They don't have any armor, and so to me it was better to not go to 1. Well, it was better for me to go to 1 rather than to block with the High Octane, because there's a chance that on the next hand I might not be able to get there, but if I arsenal the High Octane, that pretty much guarantees it. But we also have lethal on this turn, just pitching the High Octane for the extra pistol shot at the very end. Although we could have actually boosted and used Foundry Heart instead. So there were different avenues to victory there. Now for this game, we're going to be testing it where the Briar is going to be full blocking. Part of it will possibly include keeping 1-card hands that are able to attack me, usually on a break point, or normally dealing arcane damage. The reason why is that way they make an embodiment, which then means on the next turn, they're able to block with all their non-attacks and have a hand that blocks above 8. So our game plan here, we get a little bit lucky and we get to go first. We're able to actually get a Teklo Pounder and then Arsenal Payload, which has evasive damage. So this is going to help us out a lot in this game plan. But part of the core strategy here is going to be using Induction Chamber to have evasive damage late game. Problem is that when you're fatiguing with Dash, what that means is that as you boost through your deck, you're going to hit that blue cycle a lot faster than other decks, which means that as we pitch blue cards to play our red cards, we're going to get to a portion of the deck with these really weak blue attacks, and then we're not gonna be able to close out the game against our opponent. Our opponent's gonna be able to full block out of necessity, and eventually we'll run out of cards and lose. The biggest difference is that if we have Induction Chamber, we're able to shoot multiple times off of the blues, so any blue represents 4 damage, and more importantly, over 2 sources of damage, as you shoot for 2 and then for 2. What that means is that it's going to be much harder for our opponent to optimally block us out as the game goes later. And then when our opponent's really low, we need to push to that last point of damage. It means that we're going to be going wide enough that we're able to do that. And so my opponent, once again, makes like we talked about, an embodiment, and then follows it up by blocking with all of their non-attacks, as well as some of their attacks, but mostly trying to full block while still preserving possibly cards to be able to return with an attack to generate another earth embodiment, which is going to get +1 to all their non-attacks when blocking. What we're looking to do here, of course, is to set up very strong 4 to 5 card hands that are able to push damage way beyond Briar. When we get her entire hand, we're usually doing pretty well, mainly because it makes it harder for her to make another embodiment on the other end. But here, like we talked about, we see her returning with just a 0 cost attack that's going to threaten an embodiment. But here I'm actually wanting to dig for a new card to possibly fire off the maximum velocity, and this way it also denies her a earth embodiment. The only problem is that this hand does not really have a great way to actually play maximum velocity, and so while we would like to go that tall, we're pretty much just going to set up a hand that can do a lot of damage this turn, but then also arsenals maximum velocity if possible. And so there's a couple different ways we can do that. So one way we can do it is we open up here with high speed impact, getting the +2 from Teklo. That way, if my opponent does not full block it, we're able to give Throttle Dominate, which is going to be evasive itself. We're really looking to do evasive damage here. We're also looking to not really boost with the Foundry Hearts. We're not looking to banish cards off Foundry Heart for the resources. And even, honestly, a lot of the times we're not even looking to aggressively boost because our deck is basically a resource in this game. The main reason why is because my opponent's not going to threaten to kill me with damage. They are going to threaten to kill me by having me run out of cards. So that's a pretty big difference, right? So what that means is that I'm not always looking to boost, and I really should be careful banishing, because in this game, it's not my life that's a resource, it's my actual deck size. So being conservative with boosting, not overdoing it, and slowing down the game a little bit to set up items, to set up counters, and to set up hands that can push that kind of damage is the most important thing here. My opponent comes in with another Snatch. There's a pretty decent hand we can do here, where we're able to keep a blue and we're able to play high speed impact and a throttle. The high speed impact will come in for 6, but I honestly am not super concerned about my opponent drawing a card once again. And now there's a line where we can boost out high speed impact. My opponent will full block it. We can then throw throttle. My opponent will try to full block it. And then we can end with Teklo Core. And the main reason why I want that is because if I have Teklo Core on the table, it's much easier for me to build out that hand that can play maximum velocity. And we really need to find ways to be super evasive and to go super tall, have these incredibly strong hands. And that's like what we're going to be trying to do this game. Now, unfortunately, this hand is a lot weaker compared to what we could have done with the Teklo Core resources. However, there's still a pretty decent hand here where we can just boost the high speed impact into the payload, or there's even some other considerations where we can use the blue here to actually load pistol counters, and that way we can start to threaten damage on our opponent. They're going to have to block this, and this is what I mean by slowing the game down a little bit with the induction chamber. Our opponent has to block this, and it's super evasive in terms of damage because it just goes really wide. And we're not going to shoot a second time with the pistol this turn, because instead what we're going to be doing is we're going to be probably boosting and then using payload. And so, yep, that's what I'm making sure I can do. Making sure I have 3 resources available, so that way I can play high speed impact into payload. Nice thing is that my opponent's definitely going to want to block the high speed impact because they're also interested in not dying to combat damage. But that means that the payload also just tricks them out of a card anyway, because maybe they're expecting to be able to block a little bit more damage than they were expecting. So now we have one more chance to fire off maximum velocity. They're going to come in with their 0 cost attack that threatens an embodiment trigger. And they're going to get it, of course, because it would be too difficult to pay the 1 arcane and to block the 3 physical. And all that's not worth it to me just to prevent the earth embodiment from happening, especially when a turn is going to be this powerful. So without even needing to use Foundry Heart, we're able to actually have the entire maximum velocity combo line. So it's going to be throttle into high speed impact into 0 to 60. Now in retrospect, I should have boosted the high speed impact first. On the off chance my opponent doesn't want to give me a 3 block and a piece of armor, or a 4 block with the earth embodiment, the throttle would come in for 6 with dominate as well, which is honestly just better in this situation. So I think that was a small play that could have been done a little bit better, but regardless, we're going to be having the turn that we want here. This is going to be an example of how we're going to beat fatigue, because we're going to set up a hand that goes so tall and does so much damage that my opponent can't block out all the damage even if they want to. and eventually their life total is going to be taking a hit as the game goes on. Now, there is a pretty tricky thing I can do here, which is tricking my opponent into overcommitting to the high speed impacts. Of course, my opponent doesn't fall for it, but it would have been possibly interesting to do that, mainly because I could get them to overcommit to the high speed impact and then display an attack that wouldn't even have mattered with Dominate. But my opponent wants to keep that last card to be able to throw it back and create another embodiment, but instead we're going to break Goliath Gauntlet here and then play Maximum Velocity for a total of 12. So even though my opponent is trying to full block to the best of their capabilities, we're just going so tall and so explosive here, it doesn't matter. And of course the way we did that was by slowing down the game just a little bit, setting up that Teklo core, putting that maximum velocity in arsenal, not panicking and not over boosting, not using Foundry Heart constantly, not feeling like we're in a panic and we need to kill our opponent as fast as possible. Remind yourself that in fatigue matches, you're able to slow down the game because your opponent is not threatening to kill you with their cards. When my opponent is blocking with Channel Mount Heroics, it doesn't tell me that I need to speed up the game. It tells me I need to slow down the game because my opponent is now not going to be presenting a whole lot of combat damage. So now it's on me as the person attacking to try to set up some hands that can actually go beyond the defenses of Briar here. We're going to be slowly starting to grind the game out with the Teklo Pistol. The main reason is because as we're going to get through these next couple hands, we're going to start hitting that blue stack that we talked about, where it's going to be all of the cards that I have been using to pay for all my attacks since we've been pretty much pitching blues the entire time. Now, sometimes you actually might want to pitch down a couple of red cards for late game, and that can be another really good way to prevent fatigue. You can pitch even a hand that you really want, so possibly we could even pitch down a hand that could fire off maximum velocity. We could pitch down a maximum velocity, a blue pitch, and then maybe a couple of zero cost boost attacks, so that way we draw into it late game. The only problem with dash and pitch stacking is that because you're going to be boosting, it's usually too hard to keep track of your pitch stack like that, and you might end up accidentally boosting away a couple of the cards, and if they're pretty key cards, it's a little bit harder. So it's much easier in the mid-range version because you normally are just pitch stacking high octane and you're not boosting it all throughout the first half of the game. And it's much better in heroes like Chain because when you banish the blood deck cards, you're going to be able to play them anyway. For dash, it's a little bit harder. So I'm normally not too big a fan of pitch stacking individual hands, although I do like pitch stacking individual cards that are very strong. So like a red zipper hit, sometimes if I'm in a fatigue matchup, I'll just opt to pitch it down in some way and just hope that I don't boost it, although there's definitely some better ways to handle it. And here I thought I had the third Teklo core in the deck. This was because I updated my list, but I was not playing with the updated list. So the list I was playing with here had 2 Teklo cores and 2 Teklo pounders. My current build has 3 Teklo cores and only 1 Teklo pounder, and so I misunderstood my own deck. I was hoping to be able to get a Teklo core on the field and then set up another maximum velocity turn just like before. And so now here, we unfortunately get a hand that can't really do much, although it might be able to block something that my opponent does, but considering they make a rune chant, it's going to be a little bit more difficult, but we are just going to block here. And that way we're able to have a turn where we can pistol our opponent, which is going to draw out a card. We can then play a 0 to 60, and then we can play a payload. It's going to get them incredibly low to the point where a single maximum velocity turn is pretty much guaranteed lethal. And eventually they're going to have to start blocking out pistol attacks, and if we're able to chain 2 pistol attacks, if we don't have a chain closer attack, then we're going to be able to win the game. And so our deck size is still big enough at this point that I'm less concerned about the actual number of cards in the deck, and I'm more concerned about being able to push damage. We're now reaching the point of the game where our opponent is so low that they're going to be full blocking to the best of their ability, and then it's now my job as the aggro player, being fatigued in some sense, to push damage as soon as I have the opportunity to, especially when the game is getting this close, because at that point my chances of winning go up a lot more, because then any breakpoint card is going to rip additional cards from my opponent, which then means that my opponent has less cards to block with on my other attacks. And once again, unfortunately, we're just barely off on a hand that can fire off maximum velocity. It really does suck having cards that don't have boosts in the deck, but the good news is that because we have our pistol items like we talked about, if we had Teklo Pounder right now, this hand would be much worse. But because we have the induction chamber, this hand becomes much better because we're able to at least rip an additional card from my opponent every single turn, even if we are going to end the turn with a card like Magnetic Shockwave. Our opponent is so low that I actually don't really want to use the Teklo pistol just yet. mainly because I'm also still a little bit concerned about my deck size. I would like to grind out the game a little bit more. I'm going to instead use a Magnetic Shockwave to rip all my opponent's armor, so that's much more difficult for them to block out on a following turn. Because at this point, if my opponent takes one more damage and they don't have an Earth embodiment, then a payload is lethal, for example. So instead, I'm just choosing to have this small off turn to rip my opponent's tunic and to take their creepers, which is really important to me, at least how I feel in this matchup. And now it's up to my opponent whether or not they want to block. Even with a 4-card hand, my opponent has not shown that they're interested in racing me this game, so I'm fine keeping them with... It's all the same to me whether or not they have 1 card versus 5, right? They're going to try to get an Earth embodiment, I'm going to let them. And we're just going to find a way to push damage. Now this is what I talked about. We just drew into all the cards that we pitched earlier in the game for resources. So this is where we hit the blue stack. If we didn't have maximum velocity set up and if we didn't have induction chamber, this hand would pretty much have no chance of pushing damage and we would probably fatigue. Because this hand only represents, even if we pitch a blue here, this hand only represents a total of 10 damage, which most decks can block if they want to. And that's a pretty big problem. And so the issue is that when you hit this part of the game, if your opponent still has enough life that they're not instantly dead, they can just block, and then the next hand is probably going to be even worse. The next hand is probably going to also be all blue attacks. And so we're going to repeat this a couple times and then the game's going to be over. But because we have induction chamber, we're able just to go a little bit more wide, but we also have a hand that can fire off maximum velocity, so we're probably in a spot to win this game. Now, whether or not I see the maximum velocity line is a different story. But it looks like that I do, because we have 3 boos, and then we also have 1 resource left over, which means we can close the combat chain to Teklo Foundry Heart. We're going to banish our 2 mech cards, and we're going to have 2 resources, and then we're going to be able to play maximum velocity. And so we just get my opponent right here. And so that's an example of how Dash can play on both ends of the matchup spectrum, whether or not my opponent is trying to race me on a rune blade or if they're trying to full block and fatigue me. This was just to show how to use induction chamber in both cases, and it seems like it's probably the best option to use moving forward, knowing that either option is a possibility. You do lose a little bit of power not having the Teklo Pounder in the race matchup, but I think it's more important to have induction chamber to prevent that possibility of being fatigued. So hopefully this video was helpful. Just trying to give some more match analysis, and hopefully this is a little bit more insightful on how you can play into Briar. You're mostly looking to race her and then to block out relevant on hits, which are normally cards like Snatch or Force of Nature turns. You also have your equipments available as well. Thank you for watching.